Good morning. This is Sara Glidden, Program Manager for the Cultural Investment Portfolio. I'm sitting here today with my colleague, Michael Ibrahim.
Hello, everyone. This is Michael. And just before we get going, just a reminder, please mute your audio and mute your video. That would be lovely. You don't need to be on video for this conversation today.
As much as we love seeing you, you don't really need to perform as part of this particular webinar. So thank you so much for joining us today for the very exciting, dynamic topic of board best practices and ethics. I know that you've probably signed up for this webinar because of the Mass Cultural Council's new requirement that your organization needs to have a policy on ethics and best practices for boards, and that your board needs to approve this policy annually. And you might be wondering why this has been added to the grant requirements for the portfolio and gateway grants. Well, this is really partly a response to various situations both in Massachusetts and nationally that have received a fair amount of press. But it's also a response to discussions that we've had with grantee organizations, either in our site visits or in focus groups, where we've talked about boards and board interactions with mission and executive leadership and challenges that have popped up. It's clear to us that the organizations that best deal with ethical challenges have policies in place before a situation erupts, and that the healthiest boards understand best practices and follow them in partnership with the organization's leadership. We discovered in our annual report at the end of fiscal 19, we discovered that really only about 40% of our grantees currently have a policy that the board affirms annually. And we do think that that element of the board affirming it annually is a really important one. Michael's going to go deeper into the best practices, and we're using the Massachusetts Attorney General's Guide for Board Members of Charitable Organizations as a foundation for this, but it's really just a starting point. I want to take a moment to explain what we see as the difference between the best practices and the ethical issues. And this might be something that your organization already needs, already understands and knows and has in place, but we just want to make sure that we've discussed it as a group. So by best practices, we mean the policies and procedures that guide your board's actions. These guidelines are commonly adopted by the most effective and best functioning boards. So these are about the actions that your organization undertakes to make sure that board governance is doing its best work. And by ethics, we're talking about the value statements that guide your decision making and are the foundation for the rules of conduct for your board, employees, volunteers, and other participants. It isn't a requirement, but we do think it's a good idea to make these statements public. And here's some thoughts from the Council of Nonprofits, which is a public policy organization that represents the needs and interests of nonprofit organizations. So again, this is just a selection from their very robust website, which has lots of great resources. But what they point out, and we support these thoughts, is that having a code of ethics or a statement of values helps attract talented employees, recruit board members, retain donors, and of course ensure that all transactions are aligned with the values of the organizations. And here they even point out that many organizations post these statements of values and codes on their websites to be fully transparent and to demonstrate their organization's commitment to accountability. And finally, they're identifying that nonprofits often engage with clients and consumers in ways that touch on confidential matters. So adopting a confidentiality value demonstrates the nonprofit's commitment to protect the confidentiality and maintain the trust of those that it serves. So if your organization doesn't already have a policy on ethics, we recommend that you spend some time developing one. Look at service organizations and accrediting organizations in your field. Look at the more broadly defined policies from organizations like the Council of Nonprofits or BoardSource. This isn't a one-size-fits-all policy. It can be as broad or as specific as makes sense for your organization, and it should be relevant to your artistic or scientific discipline. A community music school that teaches children will have needs that are different from a historical museum with a vast collection of artifacts. Here's a selection I thought was a particularly good one. It comes from the website of the Boston Children's Museum, and it's just one item from their statement of values. So this statement, We support parents, caregivers, educators, scientific researchers, civic leaders, and health professionals in addressing critical issues facing children. You can see there's nothing in this particular statement that's about having a children's museum, but it's a very clear statement of a value that the Boston Children's Museum holds dear, and it influences their choices. So a statement like this could easily be seen as carried out through their policies and decisions on many things, including gift acceptance policies, content and providers of exhibitions, even what food they serve in their cafe or what items they sell in their gift shop. So think both broadly about your organization and the kind of work and the people that you engage with, but also think more specifically about your particular work and discipline and how that becomes important. We do think it's very important for organizations to understand what ethics and best practices are for their organizations, and it's particularly valuable for their boards to review these statements as a group, not just a form letter that is in their board package, but something that the board actually engages with so that there's an awareness that this is an ongoing commitment from the board. It's something that we think is a real value for the board to affirm annually, leaving no doubt within the organization or for external communities and stakeholders. Now, I'm going to pass this over to Michael to talk about the best practices. I'm going to come back at the end and I'm going to talk to you about what this requirement means specifically for grantees in our portfolio and gateway programs. We know that not everybody who's joined us today is a grantee in one of those programs, but maybe you will be someday. So again, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your participation in this.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for everyone to join the call. Before we get going, just a couple more ground rules. If you still have your audio unmuted, please mute it for us. It would be lovely. A copy of this will be available afterwards, so both the visual recording of this, the actual content we're going through, and also some supplemental materials that we're going to send today. Part of that is that we're going to be sending some samples and some resources and links for you that will really help pull all of this presentation together, and so be on the lookout for that today. We will be able to answer some questions. So the way this will happen is that if you want to type them into the box, we will answer them at the very end of the session, permitting time. There's a lot of stuff to get through. This webinar is 1 hour. We all know we're all busy today on a Thursday, so we want to keep it, respect everybody's time here. But we'll answer as many as we can that way. In the chat box, you may notice that you can actually direct questions to the whole group. We have a lot of people on the call. If you want to address something privately, you can change that to us directly, Mass Cultural Council. That will come directly to us, and no one else will see that. I emailed yesterday also the Massachusetts Attorney General's Guide for Board Service of Charitable Organizations, and that is going to be the primary document that we'll be reviewing today. Some folks are surprised that the Attorney General's office actually has a guide, and so we will be using that as a state agency to go through. I'm also going to say that this is just the beginning conversation around governance and best practices. This is a much larger conversation, and a lot of this conversation needs to be done in person in a workshop setting. So this is kind of a one-on-one 101 today, but we will have a real full-day workshop with our friends at BoardSource. You can see Micaiah Moody here on the screen. She is a BoardSource certified trainer. We're going to be having this on December 5th, coming up soon, 10 to 4, full day. Our location is still being determined. If you have a huge space and would like to get it to us for a deal, we'd love to hear from you. And it's going to be designed for both board and staff leadership. We're talking about really not just the basics of governance and best practice, but taking it even further to have effective governance. Really working on the board and staff partnership, when there's conflict and resolution between governance and management. Building, recruiting, sustaining impactful boards, diversity, equity, inclusion on your governance, for example, and actually planning for succession on the board level. So all those items obviously cannot be really addressed in a 1 hour 101 session, but rest assured we will be having that. And this workshop is going to be free for all of our organizations in the cultural investment portfolio. We do know that some folks who are not in the portfolio have registered for this webinar, but I wanted to just be completely transparent that we do, as part of our grant making, offer a lot of workshops specifically for our grantees. So this is just for our portfolio in person, just due to limitations. So just be aware of that. The registration link for that session will be coming out as soon as we have a space. Okay, so when we're talking about bare minimums, the IRS is our source for that. Many of you may have heard of these three duties of board service: duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. And so when a board member or prospective board member joins an organization, these are the bare minimum that the IRS has determined that is their role, their governance role within the organization. Duty of care is that they need to pay attention to the organization's activities and operations. Loyalty is that they are putting the organization before themselves and before their own personal interests. And obedience, that they are, kind of an odd word, but they are applicable with federal, state, and local laws. They adhere by the bylaws set which governs the organization, and they really are guardians of the mission. So this is the bare minimum in these three kind of core areas. What we do beyond that is extrapolate some responsibilities that the board has. But I wanted just to make sure that we were on the same page of what the IRS says is minimum of a nonprofit board member. Okay, so we're going to move on to our guide. So if you just happen to have that available, that might be a good idea to have with you. But the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office does produce this publication, so feel free to share that with your own board, prospective boards, and as you are writing your policies and procedures, you want to make sure, as an organization that's incorporated as a nonprofit organization in Massachusetts, that you have these available and everybody knows about it. So we will be going through these items right now. So the first one, as you can see, these are the actual responsibilities of being a board member, that you attend meetings and make sure that you receive detailed information beforehand about items that are going to be voted at meetings. It is best practices to always share materials, particularly if it's going to be voted on prior to the meeting, so you don't blindside folks at the meeting with important items that are going to be voted on, like your annual budget, for example, or gift acceptance policies, which we'll talk about in a moment. So that's distributed ahead of time. You have actually the right to receive all of that ahead of time. You are responsible to read those materials and prepare yourself to ask questions. You are allowed and actually really put into position to be asking those questions, and then use your own judgment and just don't take the word. We love our chief executives and we love our fellow board members, but it is your job to actually ask those types of questions and get to the stewardship of the mission. I do know that we have both board members and senior leadership of organizations on this call, so this is helpful for our senior leaders, our chief executives, to really understand the value that board service adds to your organization. Board members have rights to information. So they have the rights, and one of our lovely words here is reasonable. So this does not mean that you have necessarily an office next to your executive director and can take 40 hours plus of their time, but you have reasonable access to your management team. You can access internal information such as the annual budget, your QuickBooks statement, things like that, enrollment information, ticket sales. You have the right to reasonable access to an organization's principal advisors. So who are the folks that are giving advice or guidance to the organization? Many of you have an auditor, as you prepare your tax statements or your reviews, so access to those folks, to your attorneys and other, depending on your organizational structure, folks who are advising the organization. You have the right to access the books and records. So this is the financial books or the fundraising databases or things like that. You have the right to access those. Management must be willing to facilitate communication between the board and principal advisors. So if you want to talk to your organization's auditor or attorney, the management must be willing to put you in contact with each other and serve as that connection point between the two of you. The board has the right, if necessary, to engage the services of outside advisors at the organization's expense. So if the board believes that they should hire outside legal counsel or human resources counsel or any other type of outside advisors, the board has the right to do that at the org's expense, not necessarily the board's expense. Of course, one of the major functions of the governing board is choosing and evaluating the chief executive officer. And here we're talking about these titles can be taken in and out, but executive director, chief executive officer, managing director, whoever your chief executive is, this is the board's responsibility. Best practices in the Attorney General's office says there should be some search committee that's a part of that. And that the entire board should make the final decision to hire that person. It should not just be one person who makes a deal in a contract with a potential executive director. After the executive is hired, the board should periodically review and assess their performance. So that is a responsibility of the board. All right, a close second to that is getting involved with setting executive compensation. So all boards members should know exactly what the CEO, and again, I'm using CEO, but it's chief executive, is paid, including any non-salary compensation. So that could be benefits or flex time or time off or whatever it might be. What is the total compensation package for your chief executive? All board members should know what that looks like. Your process for setting this and the amount and the terms should be documented. Everybody has their own way to do this, depending on the size of the organization and the funds available and the internal organizational culture, but it should be documented and approved by the full board, and it should be sensitive to public concerns and regulatory oversight. So we're not going to get into today's comment about excessive executive compensation. We all wish you might be in that stage, but so we won't get into that. But being sensitive to public concerns, particularly as a nonprofit public charity who raises funds from public sources, being sensitive to that. But the main thing here is just documenting that and having all board members aware of what that compensation package actually looks like. All right, conflict of interest. And this is going to dovetail a little bit a later section about ethics. But then board members should have a policy about dealing with conflicts of interest. So when is something a conflict of interest? And what is the actual procedure and policy of that when inevitably a conflict of interest arises? There are many resources for this. And actually, the Attorney General's office has some information that says annual written disclosure there to the Attorney General's office. So we're going to give you some links after this today so you can take a look at that and see how this should affect your own organization. In general, board members should carefully consider entering into any relationships that involve conflict of interest, because going back to our first two items of duty of care and loyalty, again, care is that the attention to the organization's activities and operations, and loyalty is putting the interest of the organization before their own personal and professional interests. So this is where some of those conflicts can arise in some kind of a conflict of interest. All right, financial manners. We all know too well that one of the items of being a board is being fiduciarily responsible for the organization. So there are many more bullet points on financial matters than any other thing. So right away, your main job here is that a realistic annual budget is developed and voted on and implemented at the organization. Of course, we do require that here at the Mass Cultural Council, but working from an annual budget is helpful on so many different levels. We have no time to talk through all of that now. They ensure the organization has adequate internal accounting systems and controls. So in some organizations, having two signatures on a check of over a certain amount of money is part of the policies there, that there's software, and then there's an outside accountant looking at systems and controls, and then there are frequent reports to the executive director. The finance committee is a part of that. So what are the internal controls and accounting systems that the organization needs to keep its financial matters together? As many of you know, the board is required to make sure that all of the required filings, that is your 990, your IRS, the Massachusetts Form PC, for example, and others are up to date, and that employee withholding taxes, if you do have employees, that you are withholding those taxes and insurance premiums and you are paying them appropriately. I would also extend that beyond that to retirement benefits, taking funds from someone's retirement and then hopefully sending that to the agency that holds your retirement account. That's done on a schedule. that fundraising is done with honesty and integrity, that you are very clear about where the money is going, about how much is actually being spent to raise a dollar, for example, and it's being done in the right ways. For example, no commissions on fundraising and other best practices. And we'll talk a little bit through, when it comes to fundraising, in your materials that I'm going to send after this, some ethical guidelines from the Association of Fundraising Professionals, specifically on fundraising. Confirming that restricted gifts are used in accordance with the terms of the restriction. So a donor is the only person that's allowed to put restrictions on a gift. It's up to the organization to accept that restriction, not to accept that restriction. So if you do accept that restriction, you need to be able to use that. So a gift acceptance policy on fundraising is really important to be able to guide that. And we will be sending materials on that as well. The board should engage with independent auditors, receive periodic financial reports, and approve the budget. Ultimately, as stewards of the organization's financials, that's a major part of that work. Okay, so that's the major elements that we're going to go through in the Attorney General's office. Many of you know an organization called BoardSource. BoardSource is one of the best national organizations when it comes to training efficient governance structures. And so I wanted to take that beyond the Attorney General's presentation and materials, and actually create a checklist for you as you're going through and thinking about how are you effective. How is your governance structure effective in actually being board members? So we're going to talk about 4 areas today. We're going to talk about establishing identity and direction for the organization, again, ensuring that the organization has necessary resources, providing oversight, and then the physical operations of the board. We all know that the board itself needs some help in order to make sure that it is effective around performance, its own policies are reviewed, and that the meetings and agendas are efficient. So we're going to talk a little bit through this. But this is actually going to be the foundation of our conversations in our in-person workshop. So I just wanted to give you just a small tidbit into what we will be talking about when we're talking about effective boards and responsibilities. So the first one here, and this looks a little bit beyond our annual budgeting, but actually talks about strategic direction for the organization. So it is up to the board to make sure that there is a strategic plan, or even if it's not an official plan, called a plan, at least there is at least a defined strategic direction for the organization. It usually encompasses 3 years, so folks are in that space. More than 3 years, it's kind of hard to plan for finite change, and anything year to year it really prevents you from looking larger than what you're in right now. Ensure that the organization's mission, vision, and values are all reflected in the programs. Just making sure as stewards of the organization that its mission and vision can be actually served through the programs. It doesn't mean that you're designing these programs necessarily as a board member, but that it is a natural progression of how the mission is served. Board members are the stewards and guardians of the mission, after all. That the organization's strategic priorities are adequately reflected in the annual budget. So we just talked a little bit about strategic planning and strategic direction. We're going to combine that with the fiduciary responsibility that board members have to make sure that those 2 things are aligned as you put the budget together. Moving on to more financial work, we're going to make sure that the funds that you are pursuing and or accepting are also in support of the mission. This will tie in a little bit to our gift acceptance policy, but funds that the organization raises or writes grants for or asks donors to give you should be in support of the mission and therefore support the programs. This is one of our best practices, although it's not necessarily in minimum requirements for board service, is that all board members should be involved in fundraising of some kind. And those of you who have had site visits, conversations with either Sara, Kaylin, or I have talked about this a little bit. It doesn't mean that all of our board members are frontline fundraisers. In many cases, that wouldn't work out too well, depending on who those folks are. But it does mean that they're involved in many components of the development office, which could be setting the fundraising strategy. That could be doing grants calendars, grant research. That could be graphic design in support of a fundraising appeal. Being involved in the contributed revenue side of the organization looks great for funders and other conversations, but it also is a way that board members can steward their own fiduciary responsibility. As nonprofits, we have a considerable amount of our revenue coming from contributed revenue sources. So being participants in that work is critical. That the board's composition reflects the strategic needs of the organization. This can go in a couple different ways. Of course, we're going to be talking about diversity of board members, but we're also going to be talking about skill sets and expertise that are needed for the organization to be able to make decisions, to hear diverse voices, to be able to set the organization on a path that actually represents and services your constituency. We will be going into this item very in much detail in our in-person workshop, as you can imagine. That the board is confident that the chief executive skills and other qualities represent a good match for the organization and its current strategic needs. The current strategic needs can change over time. Of course, our chief executive skills can as well, but it's good for the board in their evaluation process to make sure that those two things are a match. The board seeks and reviews information related to the organization's reputation. So how is the organization perceived out into the community with funders? It really is helpful for board members to understand how it's perceived in the real world. Providing oversight. So here's our additional information over here on our duty of obedience here, making sure that we are all aligned, that we get an outside auditor when the audit is appropriate. Those of you who have that budget figure where you are actually required to have an outside auditor complete an audit of your organization know this all too well, but all organizations could have a review when you're doing your tax structure, your tax return. The organization has up-to-date risk management policies and plans. So this goes into how the organization can mitigate risk, and we will send you some additional resources on that from the Council of Nonprofits. That the board monitors its progress towards achievement of goals related to the organization's program. So this is in our monitoring area. So the programs, all of your programs and all of your work have goals of some kind. When we're in the middle of the year, how are things going? Are they going above or below expectations? And what additional resources need to be provided if a program is not hitting its goals? So just keeping aware of what's going on. This is where communication between management and governance is critical. That the board has a clear understanding of the organization's financial health. That's an extension of our programs. So how is the organization doing financially throughout the year? We don't want to wait until the tax return is finished or the close of the fiscal year to realize that we have been in deficit of over 50% the whole time and we have to lay off staff. We don't want to get there. So how often is the organization's board providing oversight and monitoring of the financial health situation? The chief executive receives an annual performance review by the board. We have talked about this before, that the chief executive is understanding of their own personal performances and the skills to carry out the job. And then the board members are familiar with the chief executive's compensation package. Again, the Attorney General's list was helpful to pull that out. But again, all board members should be familiar with that process. And the fourth section here is on board operations. It is best practice for boards to regularly assess their own performance, and we can help you with that here at the Mass Cultural Council. We actually do have a rubric that we've used for some of our organizations, and this process is kind of fun, I think, you know, as we talk through it. It's great for individual board members to assess their own performance, but it's also fun for the board as a whole to assess the full board's performance. Many times this is done anonymously, so online surveys to get that is wonderful. And this is where the chief executive can also assess the board's efficiency and effectiveness as well. And we're going to see a graphic in just a minute through Board Source of a scorecard of where this is done annually. Organizational board policies are reviewed regularly, so we are talking here about best practices on boards and ethics and gift acceptance policies and other things. Are these reviewed regularly? Is there a part that we attest that we agree to that? When new board members come to your organization, is that part of the onboarding process that they know about the board policies and about these guideposts that the organization exhibits governance-wise? Committees and task force actively engage board members in the work of the board. So not all of the work can be done by all people, but the organization's board has a task force structure or committee structure, most commonly a fundraising committee or a finance committee or other types of committees in that way. It could be when there's a chief executive search, that there's a search committee for that, that the board's work through committees is effective. The board meeting agenda focuses the board attention on issues of importance. So these are strategic importance. We don't need to get into the weeds at board meetings about very small topics, you know, in a theater company, why did you choose this color versus that color for the costumes? That's not work of the board in its strategic direction. That those really utilize the time of the board members' agenda to focus on those issues. And then the board members have easy access to information needed to make those governance decisions. So how easy is that? This information should not lie in a shoebox at the floor of a file cabinet in the executive director's office. How readily available is that information, particularly programmatic information and financial information? Okay, here's that graphic that I had mentioned before from BoardSource. And we'll send this out, so if you need to blow it up a little bit to read it, it'll be no problem. There's our 3 areas: our duty of care, loyalty, and obedience. And our big umbrellas, what the last few slides that I talked about, how do they fit into the organization structure of being a board member? And then at the bottom right hand, those of you who like scores and grades can see that, you know, typically, and this was a report that was done on BoardSource when they actually reviewed and surveyed their field, how they thought that the organizations, both the board chair and the chief executive officer, how well they were doing in some of these core areas. And so many of us feel like we're right aligned on mission. We believe in the mission. That's kind of why we're here in the first place. We're big supporters of what we believe is value that the organization brings to the community. But then beyond that, we're kind of okay in financial oversight, supporting the CEO and so forth. It's no surprise, particularly in that area, that the board thinks they support the CEO more than the CEO believes they are supported. So that's interesting. And then maybe not so great in board composition and fundraising and community relations. But that's some national information from BoardSource, but it's kind of a good way to check in informally with your own organization to say, how well are we doing? If we had to give our grade on this, how well are we doing in these areas, and how can we improve both for the organization and also the governance of the organization? Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Sara, who's going to talk a little bit. I know we have a broad group enrolled in this webinar. Most of you are grantees through the Culture Investment Portfolio. Some of you may be applicants. Those of you who are neither of those things may not have this directly to you, but Sara's going to talk about it, what it means for the CIP.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, at the end of this year, your organization will be doing their annual report. We are asking you in that annual report to affirm that you have a sexual harassment policy and that you have your board annually approve your ethics and best practices. So we told you about this in last year's final report. It was also in your grant packages for your FY20 grant. Again, this is a requirement for you to receive your fiscal 21 grant. So we're going to ask you this at the end of the year. We are not asking you to send us your policies because that's 306 of you and it's not really a good use of anyone's time. But we are asking that you affirm that you've done this and that you tell us the date that your board has voted. So again, that's an attestation, not a requirement that you send this material to us. For those of you who do not have a sexual harassment policy, and I'm really delighted to know that actually most of you do, the state does have guidelines on how to craft a sexual harassment policy. If your organization has 6 or more employees, and that doesn't mean full-time year-round employees, just that you do W-2 forms for over 6 people, you are required by law to have a sexual harassment policy. We're telling you that in addition to the legal requirement for those organizations with employees, that you have to have it if you're going to get a grant for this program. And honestly, it's a thing that you really want to have because it both sets the tone and protects your organization in dealing with employees, board members, volunteers, temporary employees, all the community stakeholders that you work with. If you are an organization that we call a cultural affiliate, that means you're an organization that has a parent organization, such as an art museum at a university. We are not requiring that you have the board approval because we know it's not your direct board and you don't have control over what that implementation is. If, however, your board does have those policies, it's a great thing and you as the sub-organization should know about it. So again, required for you to receive your fiscal 21 grant contract If you are one of our gateway organizations, you will be applying this January 31st for funding for fiscal 21. If you don't have this in place at the time of your application, that's okay, but you will have to have it in place to get an actual grant for fiscal 21. We have a lot of resources, and we are going to send all of this to you, not just in the PowerPoint, but as an attachment. These are some general resources about board resources and board ethics that are not discipline specific. But we also have a list that we have compiled of various service organizations and accreditation organizations, including symphony orchestras, choruses, community arts education, dance, opera, lots and several others. If you are following the code of ethics that is laid out by a particular service organization or accreditation organization, and we don't have them on our list, we would love to have that information. So please feel free to send us an email with the name and, even better, a link, so we can add it to our resource list that we can provide to organizations. Our goal here is to help you be as successful as possible in having a policy that really responds to your organization and your needs. So, the ever-present questions. Happy to answer questions, do our best for you.
Okay. So we're just going to look at some of the questions that came in, and if you want to add some more to that, we would be love to answer them. Okay. So there was a question. Yes, we're going to share examples of those policies and all the links that we mentioned. So yes, we will be doing that. Do these guidelines apply to small religious organizations such as local churches?
So the law applies to any nonprofit organization. Best practices are a good idea for any organization, whether you are eligible to be receiving funds from the Mass Cultural Council or not. So I would say do it. We will also be sending this slide deck to you, yes. So you will have all that information. Yes. There's a question about the affirmation. Right now, so we have on the CIP management tool, which is where you submit your annual report, there's a place for you right now to attest to it. The section of the website that we have more control over structuring specific questions won't go live until May 1st. And that section on May 1st will have a fill in the blank, put the date section. So don't worry that it's not available right now. It will be there May 1st for you to complete that by May 31st. There's a question about the mission statement and whether that suffices for a value statement. We would say no. The mission statement is why your organization exists, what your purpose is. The values are the support, the underpinnings of that, and reflect how your organization actually carries out its mission in an ethical way. Ethics could apply to things like transparency in fundraising. It could be about staff management and values. There's a lot of information we're going to send you for you to explore on your own. But a couple of examples. Let's say if you were a dance or a theater company and you deal with physical intimacy in a way that is not relevant to a museum, you might want to have something in your ethics about how you go about that work and how employees and artists are treated and included in the process. So again, it's relevant to you and your discipline.
I would also say that when we just did the webinar on Tuesday around sexual harassment, this doesn't just apply to your employees that receive W-2s or your independent contractors. This is also for volunteers. A lot of our organizations live in gig economy where they hire a musician here or someone to install the exhibition, teaching artists, things like that. And so the values of how you actually treat and respect your folks that interact with your organization is also a part of that. So the question to the mission statement, it also would depend because we don't know if your mission statement is a good mission statement that actually talks about values in that. So we would hate to say blatant information, yes or no, does your mission statement suffice the value statement? Some mission statements actually do actually go on quite a bit talking about the values. Most of them don't have that level of detail, so it would depend on that.
I'm going to say, and this is something I'm saying off the cuff, so Michael might disagree with me, but because we have an audience, he might not feel like he can. If you do have on your website a value statement, an ethics statement that you think is a really good one and you'd like to share it with
Sure.
other organizations, go ahead, send us a link, and we will include that in the resources that we share out with all of our grantees. So again, feel free to send us an email with that. This is not for us to approve you, but to have it as a resource we can provide to others. Okay, there's a question about evaluating the board president. You know, that's a really good, this is an organization that does not have a compensated CEO. So when board best practices are talking about the evaluation of the CEO, that's really because it's the board's responsibility to oversee the executive leadership that is handling the management of the organization. In an all-volunteer organization where the board itself is doing the management, I think it's useful, but there are power dynamics that make that a difficult situation. I think that should be a board self-assessment of itself as a whole and not an assessment of one particular member of the board, which I think would be very difficult.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have a question about sexual harassment policies in place and whether we're asking for a policy specific to the board. No, we're not. The sexual harassment policy should be for your organization as a whole. And it should include the board in that, because the board certainly has a power element in relation to staff and leadership. You want to make sure that that's in place.
Okay. We're getting a lot of questions in, so just give us one moment. Okay, there's a question about evaluation. Meeting personally with one-on-one with a handful of board members, handful of staff, asking a set of questions devised by the board chair versus a more committee-based CEO evaluation by the board. So actually how we're doing the evaluation for the CEO.
That's a really good question. Let's acknowledge up front that staff evaluations can be fraught with difficulty. So this is partly about your organization's own culture and how feedback is handled. A 360 evaluation is one where everybody gets evaluated from all directions. So top down, bottom up, peer input. Those can be really valuable if your organization has a culture where that is handled with grace. And be aware that in an organization that's maybe dysfunctional, that could be a very painful and not effective system. So I think if you're thinking about instituting a 360 evaluation format, you want to be thoughtful about it, and you really want to make sure that the groundwork is done effectively so that that feedback is both delivered and heard in effective ways.
Yeah, and I would also add to that this kind of conversation is a part of our larger conversation that we're going to have with the in-person board workshop. We're actually spending a good hour and a half to 2 hours around this. And so it's really talking, we call it the dynamic duo of the board and staff partnership. We're going to be talking through the rules of engagement, navigating conflict, some clarity within those roles, and then also breakout sessions in the actual workshop for both board chairs and executive directors to talk about what they need from their counterparts in order to be successful. And evaluation is going to be a part of that. So to the person that submitted that question, I would definitely mark down, if you can, the December 5th date, because this is going to be a big part of that.
There's a question about how boards draw on the knowledge and expertise of employees of the organization. I think that's a value statement for the organization. Again, how information feeds into the board. A lot of organizations have advisory boards. A lot of organizations have artist representation on the board. So that's really a situation that the organization needs to establish as a value? Really good question. Thank you here. Really good question about current thinking best practices about founders stepping down from being an employee of the organization to being a board member. Again, fraught with potential challenges. If you're talking about a founder who's led an organization for many years and now steps into a different leadership role, how do you truly empower a new executive director in that setting? And how do you train people to go to the new executive leader rather than to that board chair who has been that resource for so many years? Everything I'm reading about best practices is that when the founder steps away, they should step away.
Yeah, I agree with that. This is, we actually had a workshop with Third Sector New England Mission Works back in July, and this particular topic came up. And so, and we, with our site visits and our interactions with our own grantees, have talked to the new leader who came in after that process. And that board member who was formerly the CEO never could give up control in a board meeting. It was actually just the executive director in a different light. And so it was very tough for that person to actually implement their own strategy and create their own culture. And that person ended up not staying more than a couple months because it just wasn't built for success. So I would say in that too, in a larger conversation about the strategic direction of the organization, the outgoing executive director, particularly if they're a founder, which I believe the question did mention, that person should be celebrated if it's a good exit, and should be integrated into the strategic plan of the organization. How are you going to celebrate and utilize this founder, particularly when they have a lot of funding connections, if they've been there a long time, a lot of it's synonymous with the organization and the leader. So how are you going to celebrate, respect, and give praise to that person, but also at the same time allowing the new executive director to create path in that? It usually doesn't end up that that person is still on the board, but they are being used in certain ways that really pushes the mission of the organization forward.
There's a general question here about annual reporting for the Mass Cultural Council grants. So I want to clarify there are two major elements of your annual reporting. One is your data arts, the cultural data profile, which generates a funder report, which we know is a time-consuming piece of work. That project, that piece of your reporting can be done at any time during the fiscal year as long as you have gotten your final financial reporting for the previous year. So whether that's an audit or a 990, whatever your final board approved financials are, you can start doing your data arts requirement at any time during the year. And God bless you if you do it sooner than May 1st. We are thrilled to have you do it sooner than May 1st because we actually read each and every one of these and try to flag problems with them. So believe me, 306 of you doing this all during the month of May creates real challenges for us. So we hope you will do it sooner. The other element of your final report is that CIP management tool that I mentioned. And the two pieces of it that are not available until May 1st are, one, confirming who your contact people are. And we want this to happen at the end of the fiscal year so our information is up to date as we start the next fiscal year. The other section is the annual reporting. And honestly, if this takes you more than about 2 hours, give us a call and tell us why, because what we're asking you to do is to confirm that your mission has or has not changed. We're asking you to confirm that your core programming has or has not changed, and that information in your management tool reporting should be, as we call it, evergreen. So it's not, these are the 3 plays we did last year, but instead we do a 3-play season plus an educational program for teens, that kind of broad information. We typically ask a couple of questions. So for example, this past year we asked you, do you have a sexual harassment policy? That's a yes/no question. Do you have a board best practices and ethics that you affirm annually? Again, a yes/no question. Maybe we add 1 or 2 other questions as we're trying to take the temperature of the field, but there's no enormous narrative component of this. We do ask you if you have things on your mind that you are concerned about that you'd like to flag for us. Sometimes the answer is no, everything's good. sometimes the answer is yes, we would really like some support on working on a particular topic. Again, this final report, this annual report, is not intended to be heavy lifting, but we do ask for it to be done at the end of the year because we are using that information to guide us in development of services for the next year. So we're looking for it to be as close to the end of the fiscal year as possible.
Yes, and as Sarah mentioned, this annual report is not the heavy lifting that the data arts reporting is. So those are two separate things. The data arts can be done anytime. Speaking of the data arts, and if you actually want to put in the last few questions, we'll try to answer those. We've answered all in the queue, but if you've got any more, please let us know. Speaking of data arts, and this actually goes back to our slide earlier about access to financial information. This is something that board members are allowed and should be knowing the financial situation of the organization. Data arts is the actual tool that we use for portfolio organizations and our applicants through the gateway process to report their financial and non-financial information to Mass Cultural Council and other funders. So it is SMU Data Arts that just merged with Southern Methodist University. It's a national platform that takes in information from cultural organizations across the entire state, the country, and Mass Cultural Council uses it specifically in our operating support program, the Cultural Investment Portfolio. In alignment with that, we also offer a lot of workshops around data arts. So not only is it required of all of our portfolios, but we feel like beyond that, it's helpful to be able to use that data set to tell effective stories and case making. So I sent an email out yesterday to our portfolio organizations. If you are a grantee through the operating support program of the Cultural Investment Portfolio or the Gateway program, we want to invite you into a data arts workshop. And please, if you are a staff member, you can bring your board members along with this too. They get an idea of how the financial story of the organization and how aligned it is with mission. It is in the month of November, so the 19th of November, it is at North Bennett Street School here in Boston. On the 20th of November, it's at the Worcester Art Museum. And on the 21st, we're going to be at the Springfield City Library. I'm going to be emailing you that, so you don't need to write it down. But it's a wonderful way for us to go through your financial information, to start pulling stories so that we're all on the same page between the governance and the management of the organization on what your financial position is and how you can tell effective stories from that, not only to your donors, of course, but also to your legislators, to the board, to staff, and teaching artists and any other folks that intersect your organization. All right, we have about just a few minutes left for any last minute questions that we'd be happy to answer. So feel free to type them in.
And if we've answered all of your questions, well, we thank you for your time and your participation. And most importantly, we thank you for the good work that your organizations do in the Massachusetts cultural sector. It is an honor that we get to work with you.
Yeah.
So thank you.
And again, if you are one of our portfolio organizations on this and are really interested in having a full day workshop on effective and impactful boards as opposed to bare minimum of board service and best practices, please register for our workshop on December 5th. It's going to be really exciting to have both our staff and board together. All right, everyone. Well, that concludes our webinar for today. Be on the lookout today for a lot of information and resources coming your way. And thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of the week and weekend.